Giovanni.
And they're all told from like a memory perspective, like he's
Yeah.
remembering things, and then he kind of quite doesn't quite remember. He's like, oh, I can't quite remember what started it, like what set him off that night, but I remember what happened after, kind of. And I did have a question about that in terms of like, since most of this book is like the narrator telling us, like jumping back and forth into what we would consider present time in Paris to like past memories, like we kind of weave in and out of that pretty seamlessly the way Baldwin does it here, in terms of craft, but then just in terms of like the narration, everything kind of comes from memory. And I had a question, just like, what does that do for the book? Having like a lot of stuff come from memory, it's an interesting way to do this. It's a hard way to tell a story a lot of times. What does it do for the story? How does it affect the reader, etc.? Whatever. What do you think?
Well, yeah, well, it's interesting because you don't feel like you're in a memory when you're in it, right? And that's so often the case. So you forget the possibility that, there are things that might be misremembered. And I always wonder if that intention is there. I feel like if it is, it's usually an obvious discrepancy between, who the narrator actually is and the story as they're telling it. I didn't see that quite as much here, with the exception of like, oh, I was powerless to make this decision. I was allowing this to happen to me. It was decided for me. Fate sort of just decided this for me, right? Um,
At least
that I
that's what
would
the
say is like the
narrator,
one,
yeah,
yeah,
wants us to
that's
think. Yeah.
right. That's the one discrepancy, I think. But yeah, I think it's done really effectively. I think it's when we come back to these other moments, because we are, I would say, mostly living in the memories, right?
Right.
For
Yeah.
the bulk of the book.
That's what I mean. Like and I just mean like we could talk about it technique wise, how it affects the reader. We could talk about it from the
Yeah, I
craft
mean,
perspective. There's so many ways to tackle that.
on
Like,
page
yeah.
64 was where I noted, like right after they have that, their first sort of when they have sex for the first time, or
Right.
so
Same.
we
That's
assume.
that's where I marked it too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Which
said, oh, okay, we're coming back to the present tense now. And there's like a little bit of a section break, right? There's an extra space, and we start a new paragraph.
we
And
move
so,
in
like,
time. Yeah.
yeah, and there was that indication. It comes that it starts here in the south of France, it does not often snow.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's around the same place that we both felt that, like around page 64,
Hmm.
because that's where I felt it too. Is like, huh, a lot of memory telling this. It's an interesting way to do it. And I
Yeah, and
mean,
that's pretty late in the game to be like figuring that out too.
of
It's kind of
for only a
funny.
170-page book, yeah,
Yeah,
like
page
that's
64.
like over a quarter of the way through, basically. Like, but I think it's telling that you and I both felt it at the same time. Maybe it's just telling about like us and like our tastes and stuff and similarities and like our thinkings about books being so similar to each other. But I think it maybe speaks more to just, yeah, the craft element of this. Clearly that was intentional to make the readers start being intrigued at that point. If both me and Sophie read this separately and then came together to talk about it, like both felt the same thing at the same spot, well, I would say that's a successful technique
Yeah, I was
use,
gonna say I
or
think
yeah.
it succeeded, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Because like I didn't question it after that. I was like, okay, this is what we're doing. So like we first went back in time to like meet Giovanni, right? That's what just happened. And that could just be like a memory, right? He's just telling us this one memory. But then
And
this
it's
is
like the
where I
first
think
time he
we,
saw him, and like, yeah.
yeah. And this is where we sort of learn, okay, we're moving back and forth. Like we're going to be constantly shifting.
Yeah, and I think it like helps frame it for the reader too. So if we're moving even beyond structural stuff that we both said worked, it's to like help orient the reader into the style of going back and forth, sometimes in the same chapter. Because I guess we didn't even get into it. This is separated into parts, right? Like part one, part two, part three, and then each of those parts has like chapters, and then within those chapters we're moving back and forth between time, like Sophie said, with like kind of white space gaps, things that would indicate like a shift, a change of scene in the novel, typical novel structure. But it just kind of helps orient the reader even more towards this kind of relayed memories mixed with like like what's happening in the present day. And yeah, it was well done.